Thank you. It's a special treat to be able to speak to you because I'm at the end of my second phase of my life, and you're at pretty much the beginning of your second phase of life. I think that basically life exists in three phases. You start off, phase one is you're dependent on others and you're learning. Phase two is that you're working and others become dependent on you and you're trying to be successful. And then you get later in stage two, and the number one goal that you want more than anything else is to help people be successful without you. Then you can go to stage three, which is, you're sort of free of obligations and so on. And what I did over a period of time, whenever I would encounter a situation and make decisions, I would write down the criteria for making decisions. So my number one objective is to tell you that you need to have your own principles. I'll explain some things, but I'm going to share some of my principles. I hope they're helpful to you. There are things that have worked for me that I've written down over a period of time. But number one, I want to describe this experience to you. Whenever you're in a situation, and if you take the time after that situation and you write down your criteria for making decisions, then you will have that for the next time that thing comes along. And what happens is the same things happen over and over again for the same kind of reasons, but you don't see that. You're operating in a way where you take them one at a time. And so I would recommend to you that you write those principles down. When you do that, you think about them in a deeper way, and then the people that are in your lives then start to understand how you're behaving, and they can be partners in that idea meritocratic decision making, so that they can also say, is that the best way to operate and deal with that situation? And so you start to think in a more principled way rather than all of these bits and pieces of different things. So that would be my recommendation. But what I'm going to do is take you through a little bit of my journey, and it's totally correct, as Peter says. I'm really a very ordinary guy who, through trial and error, discovered some things that worked that helped me do what Peter was describing. So what I want to explain is, like, we look at the world, and there are just so many different things to have principles for. Principles are essentially recipes for dealing with situations that happen over and over again. And there's just a million things you could study. You could be a doctor, you could be a physicist, you could be someone. And the things that I understand and spent time with was economics, investments, and then work. And my approach was largely captured in this slide, which is to say, I would go after audacious goals, and then I would succeed and fail. And most importantly, benefited from failure. In other words, you go after your goals, and you then encounter your problems or your failures. And how you're dealing with those problems is one of the most important things. I started to realize, for reasons you'll probably see as we go along, that pain plus reflection equals progress. In other words, that painful situation, if you can diagnose what produced that failure and then develop principles for dealing with it at a different time, in a different way, and then you take those principles and you improve, you learn, you change things, then you improve and you make go on to more audacious goals. And the way I look at life is pretty much like it's this looping process, this evolutionary looping process. That means you go after your audacious goals, you fail, you learn. Failure is an important part of that process. You learn principles, you keep improving. And so I think that I learned that there are only 5 things that you need to do to be successful. If you do these 5 things, you will be successful. And the first is to be clear on what your goals are. You have to know what you're going after. You can't have everything in the world, but you could have almost anything you want, but you can't have everything you want. If you go after your goals and they're clear, you have to know your goals. And along the way, number 2 is you have to identify and not tolerate your problems. A lot of people tolerate problems. And then you have to diagnose those problems to get at the root cause of those problems. And often the root cause is you. Maybe you have weaknesses, maybe you make mistakes. And with that, or maybe somebody else is making mistakes. We all have strengths and weaknesses. And the power of being able to know our strengths and weaknesses and know how to deal with them is enormous. And only when you know what your problems are and you diagnose that specifically can you create a design to get around those problems. And that design, very specific design, you go get around the problems, and then you have to have a design, you have to be reliable in doing that. And everybody is bad at some of these steps. And the key is to work with other people who are good where you're weak. So I just want to give you a sense of failure. I think probably the greatest problem of mankind, it's a big statement, biggest problem of mankind, the greatest tragedy of mankind is individuals who have in their minds wrong opinions that they're attached to. And they could so easily stress test those to put them out there and find out if they're strong or weak in terms of those opinions, and to move beyond that to make better decisions. And it's a tragedy because it could be so easily dealt with. You can reduce the chances of being wrong by properly stress testing. And I want to take you through an experience just briefly of what happened to me that changed my whole approach to decision making. This was in 1980-81, and I had analyzed that American banks had lent a lot more money to emerging countries than those countries were going to be able to pay back, and that we were going to have a debt crisis, a big debt crisis. And I thought that that would have a very bad effect on the economy. And that was a very controversial opinion at the time, got attention, and it turned out in August 1982, Mexico defaulted on its debts, and a number of other countries followed. And so that very controversial point of view was right about the debt crisis. And as a result, I got a lot of attention. I was asked to testify to Congress, and I was asked to be on Wall Street Week at the time. And I want to just give you a clip from there.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Mitchell, it's a great pleasure and a great honor to be able to appear before you in examination with what is going wrong with our economy. The economy is now flat, teetering on the brink of failure.
You were recently quoted in an article. You said, "I can say this with absolute certainty because I know how markets work."
I can say with absolute certainty that if you look at the liquidity base in the corporations and the world as a whole, that there's such a reduced level of liquidity that you can't return to an era of stagflation.
Arrogant? I was incredibly arrogant. I couldn't have been more wrong. That was the exact bottom in the stock market. And we had this decade of success, and it was extremely painful. I lost money for me, I lost money for clients. I lost so much money that I had to borrow $4,000 from my dad to pay for my family bills. I had to let people go. It was really terrible. But it turned out to be probably one of the best things that happened in my life because it changed my approach to decision making. In other words, it gave me a humility, a fear of being wrong that was to go with my audacity. And it let me stress test my thinking. And so what I wanted, it gave me this notion, how do I know that I'm right? The thing that I learned is being successful has more to do with knowing how to deal with your not knowing than anything you know. And if you can then think, how do I know I'm right? And stress test yourself and find people who disagree with you, the smartest people you can find who disagree with you, and you have thoughtful disagreements so you can take in and stress test. Not only does it provide a lot of learning, but it stress tests your decision, raises your probabilities of being right. And so I have this company, this little company that I'm building, And it changed the way we are operating. And this is sort of what I want to pass along to others who have companies or operating companies about this way of operating. So what I needed was independent thinking and try to get to the best answer. And I realized it didn't have to come from me. And so I needed an idea meritocracy. And I'm going to try to explain how that works. And through that idea meritocracy, we have then these principles. By writing down our principles and those shared principles of how we were going to deal with things together, we would have better communications, we would deal with them better. And that produced successes and failures and learnings. And the learnings produced happier employees, this idea meritocratic way of operating. And it produced more independent thinkers and more audacious goals, and it produced the success. And so it was from that learning, from that very painful experience that I went through, that it changed my approach to decision making to create an idea meritocracy. So, what do I mean by an idea meritocracy? I want to be very tangible for you. In order to have an idea meritocracy, in other words, the best ideas winning out, wherever those ideas come from, you have to do three things. And the first is that you have to put your honest thoughts on the table. Honest thoughts on the table for everybody to see and look at. And one of the problems of most groups of people, most organizations, most individuals, is that they don't want to be honest and they don't like disagreement. And so, you can go out to a restaurant and somebody says, I like the food. Somebody's not going to be reluctant to say, I don't like the food. Where thoughtful disagreement is the second thing. You have to understand the art of disagreement. Because if there's disagreement, that means somebody's going to be wrong. And how do you know the wrong person isn't you? So you have to understand the art of thoughtful disagreement. And then once you have that disagreement, to raise your probabilities of making better decisions, and that certainly happens if you do it well, then you have to have ways that are going to idea meritocratic ways of getting past your disagreement. In other words, you have to have protocols, and we do something which we call believability weighting decision making based on different people's credibilities. So that's what I mean by an idea meritocracy. And do you want an idea meritocracy? Do you want to operate that way? Do you want to have thoughtful disagreement, not emotional problems, curiosity to make yourself more likely to be right? And do you want to abide by protocols that'll help you get past that disagreement? So the other thing is, you have to know what people are really like in order to have a meritocracy. And everybody has strengths and weaknesses. So the real question is, do you want to know your weaknesses? Do you want to know each other's weaknesses? Because if you know each other's weaknesses, and you're all going to be better off if you're dealing with that in a forthright way, knowing your strengths and weaknesses, because that's what makes up a great team. So when you know what someone is like, you know what you can expect from them. That's a power. So an idea meritocracy is that kind of organization. I want to give you just a quick clip of how that works, how we try to bring up information. There are many different tools, but what I found is that in order to be effective, I needed to have tools, apps, and things that were operating by that would facilitate that. So I'm going to take you into a meeting and give you a flavor for one of the tools and one of our methodologies for operating that way.
A week after the U.S. election, our research team held a meeting to discuss what a Trump presidency would mean for the U.S. economy. Naturally, people had different opinions on the matter and how we were approaching the discussion. The dot collector collects these views. It has a list of a few dozen attributes, and so whenever someone thinks something about another person's thinking, it's easy for them to convey that assessment. They simply note the attribute and provide a rating from 1 to 10. For example, as the meeting began, a researcher named Jen rated me a 3, in other words, badly, for not showing a good balance of assertiveness and open-mindedness. As the meeting transpired, Jen's assessment to some people added up like this. Others in the room had very different opinions. That's normal. Different people are always going to have different opinions. And who knows who's right? Let's just look at what people thought about how I was doing. Some people thought I did well, others poorly. With each of these views, we can explore the thinking behind the numbers. Here's what Jen and Larry said. Note that everyone gets to express their thinking, including their critical thinking, regardless of their position in the company. Jan, who's 24 years old and fresh out of college, can tell me, the CEO of the company, that I'm approaching things terribly. This tool helps people both express their opinions and separate themselves from their opinions to see things from a higher level. When Jen and others shift their attentions from inputting their opinions to looking down on the whole screen, their perspective changes. They see their own opinions as just one of many, and naturally start to ask themselves, how do I know my opinion is right? That shift in perspective of going above it and seeing the full range of views shifts the conversation from arguing over individual opinions to figuring out objective criteria for determining which opinions are best. Behind the dot collector is a computer that is watching what all these people are thinking, correlates it with how they think, and communicates back to each of them based on that. Then it draws the data from the meetings to create a pointillist painting of what people are like and how they think. And it does all that guided by algorithms. Knowing what people are like helps to match them up better with their jobs. For example, a creative thinker who is unreliable might be matched up with someone who is reliable but not creative. Knowing what people are like also allows us to decide what responsibilities to give them and to weigh our decisions based on people's merits. We call it their believability. Here's an example of a vote that we took where the majority of people felt one way, but when we weighed people's views on the basis of their merits, the answer was completely different. This process allows us to make decisions not based on democracy and not based on autocracy, but based on algorithms that take people's believability into consideration.
Yeah, so we really operate that. I just want to give you just highlight some things. First of all, anybody can criticize or anybody on the basis of a non-hierarchical approach. So we're bringing out all the complaints. We capture that information. So that way, we're building a meritocracy, an idea of meritocracy that people believe is a fair system, so that there's weighting on that, on the basis of, capabilities. And so we do this believability weighted based on data. And so nobody is going to be able to be hierarchical in that sense. You can make the decisions based on the quality of the thinking, and that can evolve over a period of time. People learn their strengths and weaknesses. And then we have behind that data, lots of data, because every day, everybody's getting a 360-degree review from that. But also, we're seeing how they themselves make decisions, and we process that data in a way that everybody thinks is fair. So people are on this mission together. My goal has been to have an idea meritocracy in which we want to have meaningful work and meaningful relationships. Meaningful work meaning like you're on a mission together. And meaningful relationships is that deep relationship, but through radical truthfulness and radical transparency. And then we use those algorithms to help us. Okay, so what's the problem of doing this? And I think it's an ongoing problem. Why is that difficult? I think that it's what I call the two U's. I've asked neuroscientists and psychologists, and everybody agrees that it's basically that there is a logical, conscious you, and then there's a subconscious emotional you, and they have a struggle with each other. So if I would ask you, would you like to know your weaknesses? Or would you like to know what I think, even if it's critical? The logical answer to that would be, yes, I would like to know those things because then I can deal with them better. But emotionally, that becomes a challenge. And so as people start to wrestle with each other as they come in to the organization, they come in there wanting to know those kinds of things and have that radical truthfulness. And that radical truthfulness brings about stronger relationships, because everybody knows you can't, that truthfulness, you'll get it. And by this transparency, this radical transparency, so almost everybody can see everything. We tape everything for everybody to look at, almost everything, so that there's no spin, there's that reality. And that has been the basis of being able to have that idea meritocracy. And that's been the challenge. And it's not for everybody. I would say, but a lot of people struggle. And then on the other hand, we call getting to the other side. When they get to the other side, when they're used to it, they can't work anyplace else because they can't go back into a typical organization in which all of that stuff is hidden and there's politics and there's lack of sincerity and there's the associated problems with all of that. So I want you to go with these 4 questions. And it's up to you to decide what you want. But 4 questions are, do you want these things and in what degree? Do you want to have an idea meritocratic decision-making process in which the best ideas win out rather than the individual thinking, you having the power, a hierarchy? And then you know what that means, I defined it before. Do you want to know what you're really like, your strengths and weaknesses, and what others are really like in order to get at the best results? Do you like this truthfulness? To what extent do you want to have truthfulness? And to what extent do you want to have transparency? If you don't have transparency, you're going to be listening to everybody's spin on situations. You want to have those things. And then beyond that, there's a great power for being able to turn those, any of your thinking into algorithms. You want to have algorithmic decision making. A lot of what we're doing is this data, and through the data and algorithms, we actually have the machine, the decision-making machine, run in parallel, like playing a chess game through a computer and doing it in partnership with the computer. So I'd like you to think about those things. Then you could think about how to get them. That's what I was trying to convey. We built a bunch of tools and apps and things, and we're going to make those publicly available so that people who want to do that, like the dot collector and those tools, will have the opportunity to be able to operate that way. We're going to make them available.